Welcome to Between the Before and After, a podcast about the stories that shape us. I'm your host, Coach John McClernand, and each episode I bring you an inspiring guest with a moving story that shines a light on the power of the human spirit. Before we dive in, I want to let you know about two very important things. Number one, the stories shared here are often gritty, raw, and vulnerable, and very likely will include speaking about sensitive topics suited for a mature audience. Number two, this podcast is also broadcast live on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So on whatever platform you follow myself or Freedom Nutrition Coaching, you have the opportunity to participate in this discussion during the live stream. And we encourage your participation both by commenting and asking questions. And so this podcast is about exploring the stories that take place between the before and after photos, not just in the realm of weight loss, but in all areas of life. So let's dive in. All right, so today is a historic day because Dylan, my guest today, is the first guest to complete the trifecta of the podcast that I host, between Wellness Unfiltered, It's Not So Black and White, and now Between the Before and After. And today we get to shine a light even more so on your personal story, which leads into the kind of the work that you do. So, man, it's a pleasure to have you back. And I'm just going to throw this out there too. I'm really grateful for you making time for this because you're also a new dad, which in and of itself is incredibly thrilling and tiring. So glad to have you here, man.
John, I just appreciate being able to have conversations like this, and hopefully people aren't getting tired of me at this point with me being on the trifecta.
I think you do such important work, but it's rooted in like everything you've been through, and you've been able to take some incredibly difficult experiences in life and turn them into a powerful work that is legitimately transforming lives in an incredible way. And so if we were to just give people a snapshot of where you're at right now, or maybe just pre the birth of your child, where you're at, because I know now you're on pat leave. So yeah, I'm a TikTok influencer of all things. I didn't expect to be that at any point in my life. I've got almost 600,000 followers. I talk about mental health, talk about things like suicide, trauma, all the things that affect us and impact how we think and how we live and how we learn. I talk about that stuff, especially the hard stuff. I myself have, I've lost my dad to suicide. I almost ended my own life to suicide. And I've come out to a point in my life where I just want to help people overcome the very things that, had me against the ropes for 20 years of my life. So I've written a book. I've obviously social media influencer. I've done all sorts of things, and now here I am. Yeah. I mean, there's already like so much that's like packed into that. So let's just rewind the clock and we'll dive right into the deep stuff. So yeah. How old were you when you lost your dad?
I was 6. I was a pretty young kid, when I still remember it was August 12th, 1996. I just remember walking downstairs to kind of my whole family, which wasn't a big family, obviously. My mom, my dad, my sister were all kind of hanging out downstairs, or at least this is my recollection of it. Mm-hmm. And there was just a tension in the room of like, something's happening that is uncomfortable. And I remember my dad kind of looking at all of us and saying, I'm leaving. I'm heading over to work. I've got a meeting that'll run late, so you probably won't see me tonight. And that feeling that you get whenever something bad is about to happen kind of rose up out of the depths of my being. And I kind of remember this feeling that's not true. I don't think I'll ever see him again. That's the initial feeling that I get. Maybe every 6-year-old gets that when their dad leaves at that age, but yeah, that was something that I viscerally remember about that experience. And I remember running up to him, grabbing his leg and telling him not to leave, in the traditional 6-year-old fashion of crying and, begging and pleading. But for context, my dad was 6'7". He was a big man. And obviously back then I was not what I am now. Yeah. So he basically just picked me up, put me down, told me he loved me and he'll see me later. And it was that cliche moment of he walks out the front door, makes that left, and that's the last I ever saw of him. And the next day, my mom woke me up to take me to my grandparents' house, where I was then told my dad had ended his life, and um, so many feelings came to came to fruition, and I just couldn't understand um, anything other than it was my fault. It was
Right.
at that age. Um, what I've learned throughout the years now is that at 6 years old, you don't have the mental capacity, you don't have the brain capacity to think outside of yourself.
Yeah.
And so what really happens is that these massive feelings of guilt and shame and regret and all of uh, these things that you can logic your way out of as an adult, at 6 years old you can't. And
Right.
oftentimes what happens is you build this profoundly negative structure within yourself of you are the problem, because that's all you can kind of
Mm.
develop within your reality. And so that's what I did, and it led me down a very dark path for nearly 20 years, until I almost ended my own life in 2015.
Yeah. So up to that point, what kind of relationship had you had with your father?
I I wish I could tell you. I like it was the few memories that I have of my childhood before six were are sparse.
Yeah.
I remember, um, and the few memories I do have were not of him. I remember sledding down our hill in the backyard,
Mm.
and getting caught up in some barbed wire that we didn't know was there. I
Typical kid
remember,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, I remember like falling off the swing set. The few memories I have nothing to do with him. All I know is what I've been told of him, and it's hard. We're recording this a couple days after Father's Day. Father's Day has always been a hard day for me because
Yeah.
I never had one. And it's always felt like I've never had one. Um, and so it's difficult to look back at my life and see, you know, what was his influence, what was his impact on me. Not the indirect one that I built within myself, but who was he before he left
Mm.
me? I've always been curious about that. And I think, when you go through any kind of grief, that's natural, right? You,
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
you desire to have an understanding of what was and what would have been. Um, and those are incredibly difficult things to have conversations about, because some people don't know. Um, if there's anything I've learned about grief, it's people want to make it okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
and that's not a good thing. I think
Yeah.
it's more important to open up the conversation, even if it's not okay, to just give someone the ability to speak, to voice, to express themselves, even if it's hard. Like, you don't have to make me feel better.
Right.
You
Yeah.
just almost want to just make me feel. Um,
Yeah.
and
You
so
just said
it,
something really profound right there,
yeah,
which is so important when it comes to the topic of grief. I think maybe we take our own discomfort with
yeah,
seeing somebody in grief, and maybe from a place of goodness, or just a place of severe discomfort. We think, I want to make this feeling go away because I don't like how it feels.
yeah.
So I'm going to try and offer some kind of comfort. But and you say this it really doesn't help in that moment. And why is it that you feel like that's not helpful in the moment?
Because I think people have to say it more than they have to hear it. I think when we get the opportunity to speak, we get the opportunity to then reflect on what we've said, rather than internalizing all of the voices that speak to us and tell us, because how many times have you seen someone, like, for example, an addict who's been through so many things? How many times has that addict been told your addiction's going to kill you? But how many times have they been offered a chance to speak about why they have that addiction? Where did it start? What
Right.
did they feel when they use it? Like having these conversations. And it's not just obviously addiction, but like grief itself. When you start to learn that you can speak about this stuff, when you can share the good memories, the bad memories, the
Mm.
hurtful memories, the fun memories, you get this opportunity to relive and process emotion, I think, in a way that becomes beneficial. Whereas if all you get is people talking at you and trying to comfort you and nurture you through this, um, I think you're negating what your body really needs because it
Right.
needs that expression. I think there's a visceral feeling that your body's emotional expression is fundamentally important in the process.
That, again, that's, that's so powerful, and you know, you kind of answered one of my next questions. Really, there's power in putting words to what we feel, because you know, in your head, and you know, we may not have the words to express what we feel, but to express something means it can start to take shape.
Yep.
And I get the sense that we need to metabolize these emotions, and I think about it as that's kind of what we're doing. We often try to push it down, but there's no way it's coming out the back end.
Yeah.
It has to come out through our processing center, which is our mind, our head, our mouth, and it's so powerful. It, you know, from 6 years old, was there a time through your childhood or adult years, young adult years, did you have a father figure at any point in time in that stretch?
I did. So following my dad's death, it was a few years later, but my mom found a man that thought was good. I think we all thought was good. We moved in with him out in the country. It was kind of a horse ranch kind of thing. It was
Mm-hmm.
like 6 acres and really nice house. We had, I think, 4 or 5 horses, a couple pastures, a little bit of woods. He kind of became a father figure, although I never really, in the beginning, I never really looked at it that way. You know, I
Right.
never really allowed it. I think because of what happened, I just didn't know how to look at someone else as being my dad.
Mm.
Um, because I think I was so internal with all of my feelings and my thoughts that I was just so caught up in blaming myself for everything that happened that I just didn't have the capacity to bring someone else in.
Right.
But that man ultimately ended up physically abusing me for everything I did wrong. It was called discipline, but realistically, it was a harsh punishment. Right?
Mm.
It was if I did something wrong or if I didn't do my chores. Mind you, I was probably between 9 and 13 years old around the time when this
Mm.
happened. If I didn't do the dishes right, I was getting beat. Right. And not just like a spanking. It was a 3/4 inch leather Western belt from the back, small of my back down to the backs of my knees, which isn't unheard of back then. But it was something that at the time when you put it in context of what happened with me and my dad, me blaming myself for all the things that happened with that situation of I put his suicide on my heart, on my chest,
Mm-hmm.
and my shoulders. What then happened was everything that I did wrong from that point on was just adding to the
Wow.
layers of internal failure and internal struggle. Um, that I was not a good kid. I was worthless. I was devaluing myself because of all of this that was happening. And so whether or not you argue that spanking is a good thing or a bad thing, when you put it in context of a child's life, more often than not, in my opinion, it's a profoundly bad thing.
Mm.
Because if that child has any kind of trauma in his or her younger years, um, then it only makes things worse
Absolutely.
because then you can't have a conversation, right? Because what it did to me was it taught me to be silent, right? Because at some point, I couldn't tell you the day, but I remember the moment when I look back at him when he was hitting me, and I said in my mind, I won't give you the fucking satisfaction of seeing me cry, right? And
Mm.
I internalized that pain, I internalized that suffering, and I wouldn't speak about it. I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't feel it. When I found myself alone in my own kind of silence in my own room, that's when I would feel. That's when I would cry. Um, feel the hurt, feel the pain, but I would not feel it with anybody else because I couldn't trust them, right? And
Right.
so ultimately, that became kind of a profound expansion of all of the guilt and shame and regret that I had. And then it built anger as well. It built frustration. It built annoyance. Um, And so on top of this, on top of these really bad feelings and emotions, it
Yeah.
built a layer and this coat, I think a wall of surface level feelings that people then mistook for being the problem, right?
Right.
You're an angry kid, or you're a frustrated kid, or you're just a bad kid for not doing what you're told. When the
Right.
reality was, is I was grieving, and
You'd
not only
never.
that, I was self-destructing.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd never been given like the opportunity to even express, and maybe like nobody really truly understood how to. And depending on what you're comfortable sharing, I'm curious, how was your mother fitting into this situation, and if she had the space or capacity to support you while this was happening, and could you share any of this with her?
My mother didn't know, and that was probably the most unfortunate part. I never knew that she didn't know until late into my 20s. Like only a few years ago did I actually learn that she never knew that that was happening. And when she did learn of that, because it was quite sudden, our leaving that situation. Um, it wasn't on me. It was actually my sister. That situation, she picked up and left. And there was very very little explanation. I didn't really understand it until obviously a few years ago. Um, but she had no idea what was happening to me. But when she found out it was, something similar was happening to my sister, we left. And so it was in that if you look broad strokes,
Mm,
I just had no idea, right? Like I expected my mom was supportive of this, but she really wasn't, right? She just had no idea. And I had never been able to, at 6 years old, I'm sorry, at 9 years old, 10 years old, I had never put it together that she was never around when this stuff happened.
right. Yeah. That's yeah. That's incredibly difficult. So this is all piling up. Going through high school and just having all of this sort of torment locked inside of you, how did that affect your ability to socialize and form friendships and relationships, if that was even happening?
I I became a chameleon of sorts, where
Mm,
I was was liked by most, um, and and that was it. I not really hated by many, um, until there were a few bullies in school, that every once in a while would give me trouble, for I was super skinny back then. Like I was probably like 6'1", 6'2" in sophomore junior year, and I was like 140 pounds.
okay. Yeah.
So I was a beanpole, um, and so that was about it. Like I didn't have any problems necessarily fitting in with people, but I just fit in with everyone, and I didn't go into depth with anybody. I didn't allow anybody close, especially when during that time, during middle school and into just very slightly into high school, um, because we lived on that ranch, we were kind of separated from society. And so when we actually moved into uh, my high school's town, that's when my neighbor was actually kind of became my best friend for a while, and then his best friend became my best friend. That's when I first started having, I think, socialized relationships, like
Yeah.
like real friendships. Um, but it's still so tentative to have any kind of discussion of the depth. If that makes
Right.
sense.
And I wonder if there's like a fear of forming an attachment because of
Yeah.
the attachment that was like torn away from you in traumatic fashion, and then like as you described, just having trauma after trauma layered on top of it. And so the fear of if I form another attachment, like it's just going to lead to my heart being torn out or feel like my heart's being torn out.
Yeah.
And so at some point you made the decision that you were gonna join the military. How old were you when you decided that was the path you wanted to take?
Well, honestly, it was quite young. I joined when I was 17, just a few weeks before my 18th birthday. But I during during my tenure with that second kind of father, you could say, or father figure. He was actually a Navy veteran, um, and had served for a while, and he was a huge history buff. So he had all sorts of movies, and I remember, um, consistently watching the History Channel on World War II and World War II in color. I remember kind of watching all of those, and he had just a bunch of military centered VHS tapes that I would watch all the time on Vietnam, Korea, World War II. Um, and when I started kind of watching that, that was kind of when I was always kind of going through this really interesting relationship with suicide of looking at my dad's suicide and saying I'll never be that, but at the same time having this desire to want to end my life, to not want to be here anymore. Um, and it kind of throughout watching that content, watching those videos, I was like, maybe that's the best thing for me. Maybe serving my country and at the time, obviously when I joined and when I was leading up to my time to join,
Yeah.
the war in Iraq and Afghanistan had kicked off, and so there's an impetus in there that I was like, maybe serving in an honorable fashion and ending my life through that means was the best idea for me. And that's kind of what it led to, is that I had kind of groomed myself into stepping into this role that I still serve now, um, as being a way out. And so I made the choice early. I don't know when, but
Yeah.
it was long before I actually joined when I was 17.
So it was pardon me, it was the hope that maybe you wouldn't end your own life, but basically you'd be put in a situation where it would be taken for you, so you didn't have to
Yeah.
uh, commit suicide. However, it was taken from you, and that would bring an end to the pain and the suffering that you had battled with. I'm kind of curious then, going into like a boot camp, and I mean, I've been in the military as well, and I kind of been through boot camp, and maybe it looks a bit different in the U.S., but it's pretty rough too, because they kind of have to desensitize you to your emotions so you can learn to act almost without emotion, act on command and not question command and whatnot. And maybe we were looking at this like through the lens of hindsight, but I just wonder how that might have affected your relationship kind of with yourself and everything you'd already been through.
I was really good at it. I've always been
Yeah.
really good at it. I trained myself at a young age to do exactly that, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
I, what I found was being the chameleon made you invisible in basic training, right? And so because I was so good at doing what was needed, doing what was necessary, um, I put myself in the situations to just take care of the things that need to be taken care of, but never put myself in a position to take any credit. I didn't want any credit. I didn't want people to notice me. I didn't want people to care about me. I just wanted to get everything done, and taken care of so we could all get through it. Um, and to do that, I always put my own feelings, my own emotions behind me. Did not care,
Yeah.
because I had trained myself to do so. Pain has never been, uh, since getting beaten, pain has never been a problem for me.
Yeah.
I have a very different relationship with pain, for with many instances of proof that I could discuss.
You've got a very very high tolerance for it, and
Yeah.
that's kind of what I was anticipating, is that it reinforced this pattern of like not feeling, of
Yeah.
putting those aside, of burying them. There came a point. So then you obviously had I'm guessing multiple tours, or I'm not sure how many deployments you had, but I'm more than one, I would assume.
Yep.
And there came a point in time, because there's something about going into a hostile zone where your life might actually end, and maybe you end up feeling more alive than you ever felt before because you have to be so alert and switched on.
Yep.
Did that kind of unlock anything for you?
So my first when I joined, when I came back for the first time, my unit was leaving. So I came back and they were gone basically, and I missed out on that first deployment that they went to. Um, Turns out I didn't miss out on much because they went to Iraq and did prison duty. So it wasn't a deployment that I was like super upset about missing. Um, but at the time, I was upset because I wanted to go. That was the point. It was like I wanted to go to Afghanistan or Iraq and do what I was supposed to do. Um, so in lieu of them leaving, I was attempting to find a deployment that I could go on, right, to get to serve my country and do what I needed to do. and put myself in a position where I wouldn't come back. Um, and it took me about 3 years before I actually got on a deployment to Afghanistan. Um, and within a week, I saw my first casualty. And so it was this moment of like pure, I mean, pure surprise. Like nothing surprises you more than seeing that for the first time. And he was a triple amputee, um, Staff Sergeant Christopher Brown. He's from, I think, 4th ID. Um, what we were told is that he had been on like 4 or 5 deployments with 4th ID to Afghanistan, in that province specifically. Um, and he had just had a baby. He had like 3 kids, married, everything. He had all the things that you're like, I wish he didn't have when this guy took it. Um, when he got hit, he became a triple amputee, and seeing that is incredibly difficult, right? Like having any kind of visual of that is remarkably hard. But then adding on all of those things of like he just had a baby, he's married with 3 kids. Um, you see this and you're like, fuck, like
Yeah.
that hits you in a place that is just terrifying. It's uncomfortable, and you're like, for me, it was like I'm processing all of the things. I'm like, do I really want to die do I really want to die? Like, I don't know.
Hmm.
But at the same time, like it's this humbling experience that you look at all of what is around you and you're like, I just got to take care of everybody else. That was what happened to me, is like when I saw that, I still remember the night where, that helicopter took off with his body and inside, and we all were saluting in pure darkness, right? And all we could see is like all I remember is like the static of the helicopter blades spinning. It was so dark that's all the light that was being given off, was the static from the helicopter blades. And you're thinking in that moment, like, what do I do with this? Like, nothing prepares you for that. If like that's the first thing within a week of getting there, that's the first thing I saw. And then the following day, I got news that one of my friends, Josh Pelton, had, I think, gotten into a car accident, potentially a self-induced car accident, and died. And so like he actually came. He was one of the last people I saw at my going away party, like 2 months before. And so it was just this double hit of, both of these things happen at the same time. And I'm just like, what do I do with this? And I remember there's an E5 or an E6 with us that I was doing my job. The next day I was doing my job, and I was like, it was rough, like all sorts of emotions, all sorts of feelings were kind of pent up. And I just remember him sitting down and like, all right. I'm like, no. And I just remember crying.
Yeah.
And
was it like the dam breaks? Like at some point you can't hold in anymore?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and he never asked why. He never asked, what was going on. I just remember that moment of just being like, everything's going to come out right now and I'm going to be fine. I remember at some point just stopping and being like, hey, I think I'm good. And he moved on, and, that was it. Like it was, it was back to, for the next 11 months, it was back to doing the job, right? Yeah. Getting it done. And I, throughout that deployment, there was a time where it was 20 to 22 hour days of me working, going on mission, coming back, doing some more work, sleeping for 2 hours. And that was my life for more than 3 or 4 months, and that is just not good for you, obviously.
I just wonder how you don't have a mental breakdown from that. Like how can you function effectively and safely in a hostile theater of war?
When you put your mind to it, and when you make it necessary, the body can do a lot of things for a long time, and ultimately, the body will eventually say no. But I don't know when that point is for people, right? right? I think
Right.
it depends on, it depends on your own personal history, your life, how you operate. Like my, for me, because pain was just not a thing for me for so long, um, I just didn't care,
Oh,
right?
right.
It
Yeah.
was there was the necessity to do what I had to do trumped all of my feelings. At one point, I even got diagnosed with ulcers when I was there, because of this, right? Like
Right. Yeah.
I remember waking up one day and just being like, God, my stomach hurts. Oh my God, this is terrible. This is terrible. I went to breakfast. I was like, maybe get some food that'll help, and I ate,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it was good. I was comfortable. But
Yeah.
then 3 hours later, when I was hungry again, hurt, pain, right? Like
Yeah.
all of the things, like all of the symptoms of ulcers. If you have food in your belly, you're fine. But if you don't, you're like, oh my God, this is terrible.
Yeah.
I went
Yeah. Your
probably,
stomach's getting a hole burnt in it.
yep, I went through probably 3 or 4 days of that before I did anything about it. I was just like, that's fine. I'll be good. Once I get to lunch, I'll be fine. Once I get to dinner, I'll be fine. Once
Right.
I once I get to midnight chow, because I didn't sleep between
Right.
dinner
Right.
and midnight, like I went to go to midnight chow and eat. I'd be fine, and then I just have that like 6 hours between midnight chow and breakfast that I was like, that's a long time.
Yeah.
I got to figure that out. Like get some snacks or something like that. But that was
So
my life.
yeah, and when you're on deployment like that, I mean, I recall when I was in basic training and going through this kind of stuff. You hear all the right things. This is what we do. We take care of you. Support you. Blah blah blah. Then you get to the theater of war, and
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, throw it all out the window. Like it
yeah.
just out the window. Was there any kind of like support counseling? Like seeing casualties. Do they have somebody available? Like, okay, hey, you've seen this. We want to give you a place to process this so you can carry on your mission effectively.
Not back then.
No,
It was 2012,
right,
and I mean we had a battalion aid station, but it was a surgical team basically. Their
right,
their jobs were to literally sew things back on and sew things up. So their their medical expertise was you know the actual wounds, not the invisible ones.
yeah,
So these concepts of mental health and PTSD and all these things that we now understand after 20 years of war, um, were just not, they weren't practiced overseas.
yeah,
They didn't have the capacity, right? We had a
right,
base of maybe 300-400 soldiers, um, and if you weren't valuable, right, like if you weren't legitimately valuable to that base, like you're not going to stay there.
right.
Um, and I just didn't see any counseling
Well,
services. I didn't hear of anything. I wasn't given any information about them. Like you just do what you got to do, and then 11 months later you can deal with it on the way out.
right. Pack it all down until you get home.
You know?
There was a moment in time. I know this because we've chatted before, but where you had this. Maybe it wasn't just a moment in time, but like, I want to live. I actually want to live, and I want to get through this. And I want to get home. Was that
Yeah.
on this deployment, or was this on another deployment?
No, I think it was that deployment, but I think it was a development over time. Like it was after that, after seeing that casualty, because it wasn't the only casualty I saw, especially in the first 2 months, because I was flight line. I was
Hmm.
flight line detail, so I dealt with a lot of medevac, because we had the surgical team. They
Yeah.
would bring Afghans, they bring Americans by helicopter to our base so we could get them taken care of. Um, and after seeing so many of them, like I saw a dude with half a head, like half of his cranium was missing, and he was walking and talking. Like it was like
Yeah.
they had a bandage around him, but that bandage was there was a straight line across his head. It was like he's missing half of his head, and that guy's walking around like you see this stuff. You see like guys with no arms coming off these birds, um, and at some point you're like, I don't like. You're like, if it's not a death, like I don't want to live like that, right? Like you almost look at everything and you're like, if it's not super bad where I die, I do not want to live like that because I'll just be a burden, right? And
Yeah.
everything kind of becomes that of either kill me or don't make me a burden to people,
Hmm.
and that there's always this idea in your head, or for me, of maybe maybe I should just try to be the best I can, and maybe nothing will happen to me, and I don't have to deal with any of that. I can just get through this, right? If I can be,
Yeah.
and so I was always turned on when I was on mission. I was locked in. I was ready to go. At one point, they gave me an M21 sniper rifle, or designated marksman rifle, and I was like, that was my jam. That's kind of where the long range bug kind of hit me, because I would take that out every week and I'd shoot 900 to 1,000 meters just to keep myself dialed in. Um,
Right.
and from that point on, like what I found in that rifle specifically was kind of a moment of clarity where when I took that out and I took that shooting, because I'd always go with my sergeant major, I'd shoot that and I'd kind of like go into my own zone. And I felt comfortable, which was remarkably weird for me because everything else in my life was not comfortable.
Right.
Um, but it was kind of that hobby that I would later carry on after that deployment of learn this because it allows you to distract your mind from all of the shit that you've been through.
Right.
And so in that deployment, kind of throughout it, I found myself kind of looking at a possibility to live. Did I outright make the decision? Maybe, but eventually that decision would counteract itself, obviously, in 2015. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's a desire to live there for a while.
So, at what point, like, did you? Because you reached a point again where you were suicidal. Was it a slow descent? Was it like, what did you? Again, we're sort of looking through hindsight, but what do you observe, sort of falling into that place where you're now at this point saying, "I want to end my life."
A lot of things built up to it. Um, as with anyone, it's not just a split decision where
Mm.
um, life is good and then all of a sudden life is bad. No, it's life is consistently bad, but you almost kind of negate it and say life is fine, right? Where you disregard the negatives, you disregard the bad stuff, you disregard the emotions, you disregard all sorts of things, and you tell yourself life is good. Um, and so at that point, by 2015, when this happened, I'd lost my dad to
Mm.
suicide, um, child abuse, obviously, bullying in high school, um, everything I saw in Afghanistan, right? So I had PTSD from multiple different things, right? PTSD from Afghanistan, PTSD from my dad, um, and 3 days after I got home from Afghanistan, I tore my ACL. Right, my goal after Afghanistan was to go special forces, and
Right.
so this absolutely this absolutely destroyed my future in my mind. It was
Right.
absolutely crushing to me because I was like, I cannot. How can I recover from an ACL tear and then go do SF? I would make it through the pipeline. So I spent 7 to 8 months in Fort Knox trying to overcome that. Um, and then I get home, take my PT test, get promoted to E6, tear my other ACL. Right. So almost exactly a year after I tore my first one, I tore my second one. Recovered again, tore my third one. Almost a year later. So I only have two, but I tore tore my right one twice. It was my
Right.
second and third tear. I tore that one twice, and I had both of them uh, reconstructed at that point. And that third one, uh, when I tore that one, I also found myself in a position of like, uh, I'm not comfortable with the relationship I'm in, um, and I don't think I want to be in this relationship anymore. So I broke up with my girlfriend around the same time, and all sorts of things kind of came out, right? Like that whole time, I was remarkably isolated. All of these things were just crushing me. I was so tired, um, and that's when I found myself in a point where I made a bad decision. I came home. I remember coming home from UW Whitewater from class, and I was just like, I'm done. Like for far too long, I was trying to stop myself from committing suicide, um, and stop myself from ending up like my dad. But at that point, because of everything that was happening, it was just like I can't stop it anymore. I'm tired of
Like
this.
I'm done with fighting it. I don't have the capacity to hold this back anymore.
Yep.
When you're suicidal, because I mean, I don't get to talk to very many suicidal people,
Yeah.
or people who I shouldn't say who have been suicidal.
Yep.
Sorry, allow me to correct that. Um, at that point, what is kind of going through your mind? Is it like, this is an escape for me? This is an out. This is, I just want to bring this to an end. I don't see a reason to live. I mean, I suppose there's a number of factors.
For me, it was I don't want to be a burden on my people, on these people around me anymore. I don't want to. For me, it was a lot more focused outwardly than it was inwardly. Um, it was less about me doing. Um, it was less about me making the wrong choices and more about I don't want to hurt people around me. I don't want to like put people through all of the bullshit that I've been putting people through. I don't want to lie to people anymore. I don't want to, because I think it was so centered around that breakup that I felt very guilty, right? And it kind of goes back right to my dad of like still felt guilty for that. I still felt guilty for him ending his life, even though I thought it was my choice, right? Like I thought it was my
Mm-hmm.
choice that led him to that. Um, and so there was so much still stuck there. I was 25 years old and I had never thought about it any differently from when I
Right,
thought about
right.
it at 6 years old. And it's baffling, right? But that's what, that's how I still kind of processed it. And so for me, it was this outward expression of trying to be selfless in the situation. And that's
Yeah.
why I have a very hard time when people tell me like suicide's selfish. I have a very hard time agreeing with that because perception is a matter of your own reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I think if you might think it's selfish of me to do what I to think that way, and that's fine. But to me, and what I think about in my dad's situation, because I've researched that now, it wasn't selfish. It was selfless. My goal was 100% to help other people get past me, right, as the problem. And was it selfish? Yeah, you could certainly argue that my choice was more selfish than selfless, but there's this idea that I didn't see it as selfish. And if I had, maybe I would have changed my mind. But the reality was is that I looked at my decision as being a selfless one,
Mm.
of ridding people of my own burden, my issues, my problems, all of it. Um, and so I think we need to change how we have that conversation about selfishness and selflessness.
Right, right.
I just don't think it's functionally worthwhile anymore. And we need to start being able to open up the possibilities of having conversations about things that bring us to process that
Mm.
emotion in that way. If that makes sense.
Rather than saying you shouldn't have this thought,
Yeah.
or
It's
you are
why.
selfish. Yeah,
Why do you have that thought?
yeah,
Where
yeah.
did it come from?
Mm. And I think about this idea of being a burden, and I wonder if it's partly a projection from all of this burden, all of this weight that you were carrying internally.
Yeah.
And it feels as though everybody else must see this and must feel this
Yeah.
energy around you. And I don't think that's entirely the case. I mean, obviously, people would have been
Oh,
impacted by
oh,
it in some way, but I mean, they wouldn't be feeling the weight of that burden, but it would feel as though they must see
that's
this huge burden I'm carrying.
that's the thing. It's like because of what happened at 6, right? Of me
Mm,
trying to process this stuff. I always crafted my perception based on how I would think other people saw me, right? Because I thought at 6 years old that people saw me as the burden because I was causing my father to make that choice, right? And
right.
so you're absolutely right, but it wasn't logical, right? When I look back now from a logical standpoint, I'm like that doesn't make any fucking sense. Like what the fuck? Um,
Absolutely.
but back then, because how I processed stress, how I processed emotion, all led me down irrational and illogical decision making. If you want to look at it as a decision making tree,
Hmm.
um, it didn't matter what the fuck the logic was
Right.
because I didn't understand how to process things. I didn't understand what logic was. I was purely acting on basically the internalized regurgitation of what happened 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And
When
because no one had ever taught me anything else.
yeah, when trauma enters the picture, it's recorded in the part of the brain that is timeless,
Well, it's
and
recorded in the body.
yeah, yeah, more than just the brain. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think about the book, The Body Keeps a Score,
Yeah.
and that's probably the one of the most incredible works of science and psychology on trauma and PTSD. So I kind of wonder, what was your, did you ever have an opportunity to have a conversation with your mom
Oh yeah.
about this, and about, and get an understanding of what she also endured with, like, the loss of her husband and whatnot?
We've had plenty of conversations over the past, I think, 6 or 7 years. Um, it's always hard to kind of pinpoint exactly everything that's
Mm,
happened in the last 6 or 7 years of like how those kind of conversations have manifested. She's given me so much information um, that I didn't realize. I didn't realize that he had, um, you know, pulled out an insurance policy, but more than a year prior to him ending his life. So it was this action was very premeditated in terms of how he made this choice. Obviously, long before I had any choice in the matter.
right,
Um,
right.
and so, it when you see that, then you realize that that decision was made long before, you know, the illogical idea that I was the problem. I was the one that caused him to commit suicide because I didn't stop him. You have to rethink things, and there's many different conversations that my mom and I have had, about how I process emotion, how she processes emotion, because we're pretty different in terms of how we do that. Um, but it's always kind of been this understanding that we've been able to actually talk about it that has really
Mm,
helped. Like when after I almost committed suicide, one of the first things that I did was I told my mom. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had to have. I didn't even have a conversation about it. I had to write it down because I couldn't speak it.
yeah.
It's about 3 days after that day, where I handed her this letter that I had written of like, this is what happened. And I just remember her sitting at her counter and she was reading it by her stove and just reading it, just crying, and I'm crying, and like it was the first time that I had ever actually expressed to anyone that I was suicidal, that I had even thought this way.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but it was within that letter was also I want to change now, and I don't necessarily need you to show me the way. I'm going to find the way. But I need you to know. It was kind of my own accountability of if I tell someone that I'm going to do something, then I have to do it.
Yeah.
Right? It's
Yeah.
the that's just how I've always worked. And so when I verbalize something or even give it to you in writing, it's like there's a pretty damn good chance that I'm going to make it happen, or I'm going to feel guilty enough about it and say, hey, I can't make this happen, but I'm going to make sure that that I'm going to work on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's when that happened, it was the first time that I had really revealed my suicidal thoughts to anyone ever, and I was remarkably surprised when I talked to my two best friends, my sister and my mom. None of them had any idea, and I'm like baffled by that because I was like,
It feels like, because it's so present in your mind.
because I hid it. I
Yeah.
was like, everybody sees me as a burden, but nobody knew, right? Like they had ideas that like he's got issues, he's struggling, but nobody had any idea that that's what I was thinking. For 20 years, I hid that, and
Yeah.
it was baffling to me that I didn't realize that nobody knew. It's just crazy.
Is your sister your only sibling?
Yeah,
Yeah. Is she older or younger?
older.
Yeah. And I wonder, what sort of conversations, and has that, your relationship with her, changed, and have you had some conversations with her about it, and what that's been like?
She's overseas. She's kind of always been overseas since our adulthood, so I haven't really had in-depth conversations about it. Um, what I do know is we both process things quite a bit differently. So it's
Mm,
um, I know what I've done. I don't know what she's done. She's a little bit more private about it than I am.
fair enough. Yeah. Well, man, I feel like we've just like barely scratched the surface, and there's so much more that I want to dig in because you have so much gold to share, and I absolutely appreciate it. But I also know that you're processing being a new dad,
Yeah.
and the challenges that come with that, and so, just as we start winding down, first of all, again, if people can. If they were to connect with you, I know again you're kind of a little bit disconnected from the coaching that you do while you go through this period of paternity leave. But if they want to get somehow connected to you, learn a bit more about what you do, where do they find you?
So right now, I'm going to be starting up my coaching again back in July. Uh, www.dylensessler.com is probably the easiest place to go.
Mm.
You can find me on TikTok. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook. But yeah, you can find obviously my books up there on the screen. That's on Amazon, Target.com, Barnes and Noble, all sorts of places.
Yeah, Defy the Darkness. I mean, I almost want to have a separate episode for you to talk about that, and even the process of writing that. So I might have to try and book you again in the fall and to do a fourth with you. So,
Absolutely.
but just in a super condensed nutshell, maybe peanut size, Defy the Darkness. What is that about?
So that's basically I think a self help guide, right? It's how I process through my emotions. It's not necessarily a this is how you do it, but it's a this is how I did it, and this is how I think it can apply to you, right? I
Mm,
think it's riddled with uh, pieces of the process. It's not going to give you everything that you're going to need because that is fundamentally your process. You're different than I am, and that's fine. But it gives, I think, the structure of how to overcome really hard things, how to process through things. What do you need to know? It talks about love. It talks about relationships. It talks about expression. It talks about all sorts of things that are necessary in terms of how to how to move forward. And I think that's what Defy the Darkness really was for me was my first attempt to express. Right, it was my first attempt to really give people an idea of what it means to actually overcome. Because I really feel like I'm in a place right now where I feel almost invincible. Right, I know things are going to happen to me that are remarkably hard. It's already happened to me. Right, like so many things since going through that episode in 2015 where I was suicidal in 2015, and now obviously I'm a dad, right? I'm a father
mm,
to my own daughter and my stepson, who I treat as my own son. I'm a husband. I'm so many different things. Obviously, I've written a book. I'm a podcast guy. I'm a social media guy. But I'm able to look at myself now and love and respect myself. Right? I don't look at myself and say you're a worthless piece of shit anymore.
right. Yeah.
I look at myself with honor, integrity, and value with of who I am, and I'm happy with that. I'm happy. I'm at peace with who I am, and to get there has required so much work. And I Defy the Darkness is an attempt to share that with people. It's not
Mm,
it's
mm.
not my last attempt. I certainly have other books in the queue right now,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but that's my first attempt, and I think people will hopefully take something from it. I think everybody can take something from it if they want to,
Yeah.
but there's more to come.
Awesome. That's amazing. I think we'll have to like maybe just as a teaser say we're gonna have like part two, Dylan from 2015 forward, and we'll sort of unpack that
Yeah,
because I know there's more in there,
there's a
and I
lot
think
more.
just being able to share the way that you've navigated through some of the hard experiences you've had since that time would also be really valuable for people, and so
Yeah.
I'm very excited for that one there. As a final sort of send off here, if we could just give people maybe one valuable nugget of takeaway from like the experience and this conversation we've had, what would you like people to take away from this?
So I haven't posted this, but I wanted to share something I wrote a couple weeks ago that I was kind of thinking about it. And so I'm gonna read this to you. It's a short paragraph, but it's something that's valuable. We like to think of life as a noun, but life is not a person, place, or thing. Life is a verb. It's the action and movement between all things. When you get caught up looking at life like a noun, you become singularly focused on one moment at a time. The reality is different. Life is like the ocean's constant ebbing and flowing waves, rising to the good times and descending into the depths of the bad times. At every step, life is a process, a chaotic puzzle being pieced together. It is moldable, malleable, shapeable entity that never dies. Life goes on whether your feelings are hurt or not. When we see life as a noun, we limit our capacity to see the whole picture from start to finish. Life is a verb, and verbs have different tenses based on past tense, present, and future. Don't forget to add the future into your verb.
I love that, man. That's awesome. I think we just have like a highlight clip from the podcast from this episode, just from that there. So, man, it has been such a pleasure. It always is when we get to connect, and I look forward to when we get to connect again next.
Appreciate it, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Between the Before and After. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, or leave a review, because that helps this podcast to reach and inspire more people. I love exploring the stories that take place between the before and after, the powerful experiences that shape who we become. And I love human potential. I love the possibilities that lie within us. So whatever you may be up against, I hope these stories inspire you, because if you're still here, your story's not done yet, so keep moving forward.
Anyone can come from any place of brokenness and destitution and build an amazing life.